Hello, it's David Leroy here, and in this slide presentation, I'm going to be talking about prompts and questions that are used in forensic interviews. And for anyone who's wanting to learn about forensic interviewing, a really core aspect of understanding forensic interviewing is having a good grasp of the different types of prompts and questions that are used within forensic interviews. And what I've done here is created four categories to help you understand the difference between the different types of prompts and questions. And these four types of prompts are arranged here in a type of a hierarchical fashion. So at the top of this list, I've got open prompts. And these are ones that forensic interviewers are always recommended to use as often as they can. I'll elaborate on some of the reasons why that is as we go through the slide presentation. Um, there's also different categories of questions that fall into the directive and option posing zone. And I've coloured these blue because these are sometimes very good forms of questions to use, but they do need to be used with a little bit of thought, and they need to be used carefully and with understanding of the different costs and benefits of different forms of question. And at the bottom of the list here, I've got suggestive statements and questions. And these are in red because these are the sorts of things that you would really never want to see a forensic interviewer using. Suggestive questions are known to be incredibly problematic and lead to all sorts of distortions within the criminal justice system. So those are the categories, and they're organized in a hierarchy. When you attend forensic interview training, um, and if you were to ask people on a course learning about forensic interviewing, well, what type of question should we be using? Most people would be able to say we should be using open prompts. But if you ask a different type of question, you ask somebody, okay, so open prompts are important to use, but what's the definition of an open prompt? That's actually a little bit more difficult for people to wrestle with. So just pause the video for a moment and think to yourself, what would you say the definition of an open prompt is? A good definition that I use is an open prompt is any utterance by a forensic interviewer that does not restrict in any way what a child can say, right? And that's why they're open, because they don't have the same boundaries or specificness that is going to cause a child to think that only a small answer is going to be required. So what are open prompts? Well, here's some examples. So when we talk about open prompts, these are the sorts of things that interviewers might be able to say. Tell me more about that. Tell me what happened. Tell me everything. Then what happened? What happened next? These are all prompts that the interviewer can use that are going to help the child provide information in their own words, and these types of prompts don't restrict what the child should say. So if a child's got a lot to say, they can say a lot. If they don't have too much to say, they can just say what they know. So interviewers, yes, are encouraged to use these open prompts, but you couldn't conduct a forensic interview with a child by simply saying, tell me what happened, tell me what happened, tell me more about that, because eventually it would start to feel a little bit oppressive. And so what interviewers learn to do as they get more experienced and skilled is to combine some of these open prompts with information that the child has already provided. And we call these cued invitations, or if you like, cued open prompts, because they contain a little bit of information that the child's provided and then that is followed up with an open prompt for a request for information. So here are some examples of those. Earlier you mentioned that Dad came home. Tell me everything about that. And so you can listen to what the child's saying and just take some of the little pieces of information that they give you, put them into this cued invitation, and then follow it up with an open-ended prompt. Tell me more about that. Here's another variation of a open prompt, and we call these time segmentation prompts. And so quite often the interviewer is going to need to narrow the focus of their discussion to particular aspects or particular features of the alleged crime that the child is going to talk about. So it might be that a child says, well, Dad came home and then something bad happened and then we went to the park. Now, the interviewer or investigator is obviously going to be wanting to know more about what this bad thing was. So they could follow up using a time segmenting question like, tell me everything that happened from the moment that Dad got home until the moment that you went to the park. And that's a way of still being able to use an open prompt, but also give the child some direction as to which aspects of their memory that you are wanting to inquire about. So open prompts have been very well studied, and you won't have to look far to be able to find plenty of research that's looked into the efficacy of open prompts. And I've got a couple of points here that are really just based on my reading of a lot of that type of research. Why are open prompts a good thing to use? Well, there's actually a number of reasons um, that you would want to use open prompts. And there's a number of reasons that make them really, really useful ones for forensic interviewers to be using. At the top of the list, it's important to be aware that open prompts tap what psychologists call as free recall memory. And this is a situation where without any clues from the interviewer, you're going to try and set up a situation where the child needs to time travel back to that experience, recover the memory of that time, and then feel that they can freely recall the aspects of that memory in any way that seems appropriate to them. Now, what we know is that open prompts elicit longer and more detailed responses than closed and specific questions. And this is an important feature of open prompts because when children are put in situations where they're doing most of the talking and the interviewer isn't really leading the child at all, that creates narrative that fact finders and juries and so forth and other professionals tend to find more credible, which is really important. Feature of using the open prompts. It would be a bit of a disaster if we could get all of this extra information from children, but for some reason people doubted narrative that comes out of that context. What research has also been pretty clear about is that open prompts produce the most accurate recall out of your witnesses. So that's a pretty easy type of thing to study. If you can imagine experiments where you've got different groups of people that are exposed to the same type of to be remembered event, and then you would just have different groups that are questioned in different ways. One of those ways could be using open prompts, or predominantly using open prompts versus other types of questioning formats. And what we see is that open prompts are usually the winner on the day. So not only are they producing longer, more detailed responses that look credible, we know that in addition to them looking credible, they are also probably accurate as well. And what's really useful about open prompts is that accuracy and in response to open prompts holds true irrespective of age and delay. And so some things change with, for example, age. We know that younger children provide fewer details in response to open prompts compared to older children and adults. But if you're to look at the accuracy of that information, what you would find is that even young children, although they don't provide much information, can still be providing accurate information. They could still be quite good informants if we use the open prompts. And also, open prompts obtain more accurate information irrespective of delay. And so we know that after very long recall delays, people find it more difficult to recall their experiences, they recall fewer details, and they make more errors. But when we've looked at the efficacy of open prompts and experiments that have manipulated recall delay, what we do find is that people recall fewer details as time marches on. But if open prompts are used even after a long delay, that's your best chance of obtaining accurate information. And another really useful feature of open prompts is that they're non-suggestive. And that means that interviewers that use open prompts aren't going to be criticized for doing that. Interviewers will be criticized for not using open prompts, and they'll be criticized for using suggestive questions, but interviewers that are able to deploy the use of open prompts throughout their interviews are going to generally receive encouragement to keep on doing that. So that's a few comments about open prompts. I want to turn now to making a couple of points in relation to specific questions and the use of specific questions. So if you think of specific questions, they could be the what, when, where type or a yes, no type answer. Often these questions contain concepts that children have difficulty understanding, or they have emerging abilities in their use of the concepts. And things that we find really simple ourselves, often children have different ways of seeing things. So we would think as adults that concepts like before and after, or in front of and behind, are pretty easy concepts. But children have, like I said, emerging abilities to understand those concepts, and they have, emerging abilities with language and the way that they use words. So if we asked a child, was it, in front of the house or behind the house? A child might perceive the back of a house as being the front if it's the, part of the house they come and go from, or if it's the door they go out to play in a backyard, for example. So sometimes those types of questions that use concepts that we take for granted can cause some misunderstandings. Also, children are going to naturally use words before they understand the adult-like meaning as well. And so need to be really careful when we're asking a question that we've not put a word in it that a child might not understand. So I'm thinking of an example with one of my sons who was going to go to a Cubs camp, and his mother said, remember to pack your lunch, and he looked at his mum and said, no, they give us lunch when we go to camp. And his mother took out a form that had information about the camp, and she showed it to him and said, well, what does that say? And he looked at it and he read out, lunch will not be provided. And then he looked at his mum and said, what does provided mean? So what this wee boy would have been hearing is lunch will not be blah, 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 right? And children will not understand lots of the communication that they're listening to, but still make their or still do their best to be able to provide some sort of answer that fits with the best way that they know how to answer questions. So they will also try to answer questions they don't understand. So if you ask children nonsense questions, sometimes you'll see them thinking about the answer. So if you ask a child, how many wigs are in a wug, they might sort of ponder that for a second and think, well, I should be able to provide an answer, and they may end up just trying to guess, even though that the sentence itself or the question is nonsense. So another example of children playing loose and fast with words. My dad puts fast petrol in the car so it goes bigger. Right, there's something not quite right about that sentence, but you can see if you're a 4-year-old and you're trying to communicate to a grown-up, you're going to choose words that are available or that sort of convey the impression that you want to give. And so we know that a car doesn't go bigger if you put fast petrol. It'll go faster, but I sort of understand what the child's trying to say there, but we still need to be careful. And another statement here, are you going to use the ski hammer? And this is an example from a little boy who went to the hardware store with his father. His father wanted to buy a sledgehammer to do some home repairs. They got home and the child wanted to know when we were going to use the ski hammer. So how did that misunderstanding happen? Well, a sledgehammer, I think probably at the hardware store it sounded like a sled. And then it's not a big leap of the imagination to think a sleigh ride, a sled, skiing, and then it became a ski hammer. Now, why I've given you some of those examples is just to sort of reinforce your curiousness about little statements that children will make. And we need to be prepared that even though sometimes things might seem a little bit odd, a child might still be doing their best to be able to provide information. And we just need to be particularly careful around issues with children when we're asking specific questions. So another important point is to do with the WH format of question. And this is the what, when, where, why, and how format question. And these are very common questions to be used in any investigation and by any professional. And what's important to remember is that form of a what question or the WH format those questions fall on a continuum of being extremely easy to answer or at the other end of the continuum being very, very difficult to answer. So if you were to lead out in an interview with a lot of WH type questions, what's your brother's name? How old are you? What school do you go to? What you'll usually get is a child very competently being able to answer questions like that, right? My brother's name is Trevor. I am 6 years old. I go to the Sawyers Bay Primary School, where they live, and so forth. And when interviewers sort of do that warm-up exercise of going through some of the WH questions, they have a child being able to answer them, and probably the interviewers would know they're answering them correctly if they've already found out how old a child is and who their family members are and what school they go to. Interviewers themselves might be led into a false sense of security, thinking, you know what, this child's pretty good at answering WH questions. But this is referred to by psychologists as trivial persuasion. So it's going to persuade an interviewer that the child's competent at answering these types of questions through asking a bunch of trivial questions, right? And so just because they can get questions like this right most of the time does not mean that they are going to be able to answer all WH questions accurately, because some are going to be very difficult to answer. And I think that this is a point that is important for forensic interviewers to give some thought to and grapple with a little bit when you're formulating WH questions. Are they easy to answer questions, or is there something about them that's going to be more difficult? And so a WH question, right, that looks quite innocent, what is on the back of a 50p piece? Now, we've all probably used a 50p piece at some point if you live in the United Kingdom. But I struggle to imagine what's on the back, and even if I could picture something, I would wonder just how accurate my recollection of that would be. And what we see in forensic interviews is interviewers trying to sometimes test a child. Well, if you say that you used a 50p piece, you must know which way the Queen's head faces. You must know what's on the back. If you saw it, you should be able to remember it. But that's not the case, and psychologists know that memory doesn't really work like that. There's lots of very specific details that we either don't encode into our memory because they're unimportant, or if they are encoded, they're often quite quickly forgotten. And so in forensic interviewers, you can often see very focused questions. So the child might be asked, where do you live? What school do you go to? But then later in the interview, using that WH format question, interviewer might say, what colour was the shirt that he was wearing? What finger did he use? What was the number plate of the car? And these can all be questions that might greatly help an investigator because you'll be getting really useful forensic information. But it's really important that, to realize that, a lot of that information that you could be inquiring about might not be very well remembered at all and cause a child to try and guess an answer, which, has implications for how credible they're going to look when the evaluation of their testimony takes place. Also, focus questions can cause a little bit of confusion, and I talked on the previous slide about some of the concepts that children are learning to use. They might use words in different ways, have different understandings of them. But even simple questions, for example, I'm thinking of a case where a child was abducted and assaulted. The police had arrested a man who was driving an orange car. And when the little girl was interviewed, the police wanted to, make some links between what they knew and the testimony that the child was able to provide. And so they asked the child, what color was the car? And she said that the car was black. And so on the surface, that might look like quite an inconsistency. Well, how can we arrest someone in an orange car and now we've got the witness saying that the car was black? Well, this is an example of just how careful we need to be with the WH format questions. It turned out later in the investigations that the interviewers were able to uncover the child was talking about the inside color of the car. So the inside of the car was indeed black, and that's what the child saw, and that's what she thought the interviewers wanted to know. But when we think about the color of cars, we normally think about the outside color of a car, and that's in the adult world. There is a norm that if someone asks you what color is your car, you're going to tell them what the outside color is because that's the part everyone sees. And so when interviewers need to ask questions, so it could have been quite important in the case to be able to confirm that the child's description of the car was indeed that of the person that they had arrested. What color was the car? So a good interviewer might recognize that a question like that, as simple as it is, could lead to a misunderstanding, and then good interviewers can improve the form of that question. So it's a question that may have to be asked, but you might say, what color was the outside of the car? And then you've just added an extra few words into the question, which can help the child understand what you mean, and it can help you rely more confidently on the answer that you're getting. And so it can also cause misunderstandings. So it's often the case forensic interviewers tell me, they're trying to establish the location of some alleged abuse. Where did he hit you? And the child might say at home or at grandpa's house. And it's not really what the interviewers were meaning. They were meaning, whereabouts on your body did he hit you? So even a question like that, where did he hit you? A good interviewer might recognize that there could be a possibility of some confusion, so we might change the form. Where on your body did he hit you? Might be an improvement to that type of question. And also, WH questions can inquire about information that's just simply not remembered at all. And there are things that happen to us in our lives that our brains do a very poor job of recording. They do a poor job of recording dates. If you go back through your memory and you can remember different birthday parties you've had, well, you're going to be able to establish the date of those pretty easily. But there's lots of other experiences that we've had in our childhoods that we know we've had that experience. We have a memory for it, but if there was some, forensic need for you to be able to pinpoint exactly when certain memories occurred, people would find that very, very difficult because our memory does not work like a video recorder that stamps the time on all of our memories. The brain also does a very poor job of remembering how many times things happened. We can usually remember the first time an experience happened. We can remember a recent time, maybe the last time something happened. We might be able to remember another time something happened, but trying to remember the exact number of times different experiences have happened to us can be very difficult. I can remember the first time I went to a game of basketball. I can remember the last time I went to a game of basketball, but I can't remember all of the different games of basketball that I've been to, so I wouldn't be able to give you a specific number. And quite often in investigations, and forensic interviewers might reason that it would be quite helpful to know how many times a particular episode of abuse might have occurred, but then that can put children in a position, well, if they don't know, they need to still convey some information, so they might make an obvious guess. So they could say thousands of times, hundreds of times, about 10, and so forth, and choose some sort of round numbers in their answer. Here's an example of a problem with very specific questions. So I'm thinking here of yes-no questions, and I've taken this example from a forensic transcript. And this is a child who has been previously interviewed, and they've come back sometime later, they've remembered something else, and they want to talk to the interviewer again. And so the interviewer begins this interview saying, you came to see us on Wednesday, a couple of days ago. And the child says yes. So it's good that you've come back to talk to us, because I think on Wednesday you told us some things, but you wanted a wee bit of time to think about things, and that you would come back and talk to us again. Uh-huh. Is that okay? So you've been doing some thinking since Wednesday, and then the child realizes, actually, on Wednesday I was on the playground. Now, I had the case file notes that also had the dates of the different interviews included. And the interviewer has misremembered the day that they spoke to the child. They spoke to the child on a Tuesday, but when they came to talk to the child again, they remembered the day wrong, but still included that in what looks like a pretty innocent question. And so it's incorrect. They didn't see the child on a Wednesday, but they say, you came to see us on a Wednesday, didn't you? And the child agrees, and that is what we refer to as acquiescence. Acquiescence is a yes-saying tendency that children have. So if you ask children lots of yes-no questions, they will just say yes and agree with it more often than they will say no. And that's a problem in forensic interviews. Now, here we've got a situation where the interviewer themselves can't remember what day they met the child. It was only a few days earlier. It was a Tuesday, and they've misremembered it as Wednesday. In that forensic interview, as the interview went on, and the interviewer started to probe for information about the alleged abuse, that abuse was alleged to have occurred months and months and months ago. And the interviewer asks the child, "Do you remember which day it was? Which day of the week?" And so this just sort of illustrates the problem we have as humans in understanding our own abilities and those of children. So here we have an interviewer that can't remember the day they spoke to a child a few days earlier, and then they're expecting the child to be remembering a particular day that happened months and months earlier. Here are a couple of examples that just illustrate the difference between the open prompts that interviewers are recommended to use and the closed and focused questions, which are less effective. So I made this example up. So imagine an interviewer speaking to a small child during the rapport building phase of a forensic interview. They want to just make some, inquiries about the child so that they can build rapport. But in this example, I've just made those inquiries in the form of closed and focused questions. So have a look and see what happens here. Do you or do you not play with your doggy? No. She plays with you, doesn't she? Yeah. Does she lick you? Maybe. Your mum said her name was Molly, is that right? Yes. Do you play with her outside? Yes. How many times do you play with her? 100 times. So what we've got here is closed and focused questions with the child providing answers to those questions. So have a look what really happened in the interview. This was a 6-year-old boy. The interviewer actually used open prompts at the start of the interview to build rapport. Tell me everything. I like to play with my doggy, so tell me everything. She plays with me and licks me. Tell me more, because she likes to. Tell me more about that. Tell me everything. Her name's Molly. She likes to play with me outside. Then what happens? She goes away and plays with my sisters. Now there we've got two different types of narratives that have been obtained using two different types of questioning styles. And a really good test is to delete everything that the interviewer has said and then see if you can still make sense of it. So this little boy in his real interview was asked open prompts. So they're input-free prompts. They don't actually have any information in them. If you delete what the interviewer said, things like tell me more about that and so forth, and just look at what the child's saying, even though they provided that information in a piecemeal fashion, right, and several open prompts were used, if you look at it, it still makes a narrative that stands on its own. We can still tell a little bit of a story about what the child is saying. I like to play with my doggy. She plays with me and licks me because she likes to. Her name's Molly. She likes to play with me outside. She goes away, then plays with my sisters, right? And so we get in a sense of what that child is doing with their dog. And we get that because the interviewer used open prompts. Now, for the closed and focused questions, if you delete what the interviewer says, you're left with no, yes, maybe, yes, yes, 100 times. That does not make sense on its own. And so to understand what the child's saying here, we have to include the narrative of the interviewer. And remember, the most credible types of testimony are going to be ones that come from the open prompts because they look like more of an independent story that the child's been able to tell. And this looks more like a construction of a narrative based on the questions that the interviewer is asking. So I've just got one more slide here on suggestibility. And in brackets here I have confirmation bias. The biggest threat to the accuracy of information in forensic interviews is interviewer bias. And when interviewers are biased, they often resort to using subtle and overt suggestive techniques. Now, suggestibility as a topic has been studied in enormous depth, and you will not find it difficult to find studies of children's suggestibility. There probably are hundreds, if not thousands, of studies that have been conducted on that topic. And one thing that we've learned is that there are many, many varieties of suggestibility, and there are lots of things that interviewers might do in forensic interviews that we know from research are very, very problematic, and that will cause children to provide inaccurate testimony and untrue allegations in their interviews. So here are some of the different varieties of suggestibility. There can be misleading questions, right? Interviewers can provide inaccurate information and then still expect the child to be able to elaborate on it. Sometimes interviewers, if they don't get the expected answer, will start repeating questions. Well, we know that repeating questions can be suggestive because they've been really well studied. Children have been questioned about known events that have happened to them, and then they've been asked the same questions again, and children sometimes just change their answers because they think that, oh well, I'm being asked that question again. The grown-up must think the first answer was wrong, so I'm going to change my answer in order to try and please the forensic interviewer. There's also social pressure, and the subcategory of that is peer pressure. So sometimes in interviews, interviewers might get frustrated if the child's not providing enough information, and they could resort to saying things like, well, your mum told us what happened, now it's your turn to tell, or all of your friends have told us, now it's your turn to tell us about the bad things that Peter did. And there's some other phenomenon: imagination inflation, effects of negative reinforcement, asking children about false events, if children look like they don't know answers, just encouraging them to guess, and so forth. And so all of these, yeah, are very, very well studied and fascinating to read about. So I'd recommend, if you are interested in the topic of suggestibility, that you look as a starting point to the work of Maggie Bruck and Steve Ceci, and they've conducted an enormous amount of suggestibility research with young children, and there would be a really good starting point. Thank you.